Next month marks 2 years since the death of convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein inside a New York City jail. His then-girlfriend and alleged accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell, remains in jail, awaiting a possible trial later this year on sex trafficking charges. While few details are known about Epstein and those around him, a new podcast is shedding light with some never-released transcripts of conversations he had nearly 20 years ago.
We only very recently discovered that it seems as though Jeffrey was donating to Bill Clinton in the first year of his presidency in 1993. But in 2002, we didn't know any of this. So I just couldn't answer the question, why did people of importance think so highly of Jeffrey Epstein? And yet, there were little clues. One person did tell me that there was plenty of dirt to be had, but that basically these rich, powerful men, and they are for the most part men, would never talk. This person told me that there was far too much self-interest at stake.
Joining us now, author and journalist Vicky Ward. She's the host of that new podcast, Chasing Ghislaine, which is the culmination of her 19-year investigative undertaking that began with a series of interviews she conducted with Epstein as she wrote her 2003 Vanity Fair profile. And what happened with that profile, Vicky?
So what happened with the profile was that Jeffrey Epstein went on a charm offensive with me, trying to sell his version of events. He wanted the world to think that he was some amazing money manager for billionaires only. When that didn't work, he threatened me, and we have 450 pages of transcripts of those conversations. I ended up talking with him almost daily for 2 or 3 months. And when that didn't work, he went around me to my then boss, the editor of Vanity Fair at the time, Graydon Carter, with the result being that allegations by 2 sisters, Maria and Annie Farmer, were at the last minute cut out from the piece. And there is a scene that I recount in the podcast where I am working with the fact checkers to close this piece out. And she writes to me on email, my goodness, guess who's just appeared in the office? Jeffrey Epstein. Well, I mean, that was most unusual, to say the least.
So I know that there's a lot we want to hear about in terms of getting folks to listen to this podcast, which I think is incredibly important. Anybody who cares about the women, many, many young girls who were abused by this man and with the help of Ghislaine Maxwell might want to listen. I'm curious about the powerful men that have never really been nailed down, who worked with Jeffrey Epstein, who he provided women for. There have been allusions to certain well-known powerful men, but no one's ever been able to make the true connection. Why do you think that is, and what do you know that might help? And who are these men?
Right. So, I mean, I think the men is the reason we're still talking about Jeffrey Epstein 2 years later, right? We're here that we read their names in the newspapers. We've learned about Bill Gates. The name Bill Clinton has been talked about. Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, the financier Leon Black, the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, former retail king Leslie Wexner, on and on. And the men is why I wanted to make the podcast, because when Ghislaine Maxwell, who I knew long before actually I was assigned to write about Jeffrey Epstein, I didn't even realize they were a couple, if you can believe that, back in the day. It's a sort of gateway to this shadowy world of men. And without the men, Jeffrey Epstein would not have been propped up to run his criminal sexual enterprise. And I think what's important, and what I've gone out and sort of re-reported, based largely on all these pages of what he told me back in 2002, is that it wasn't just about sex. it wasn't just about the women. There's much more to this story. There's much more to Jeffrey Epstein and to his world of invisible men than people think. Jeffrey Epstein was also a masterful con artist. He was an embezzler. He knew how to move money around offshore. He was, so it's claimed by several people on the record in this podcast, part of an intelligence network. He was also a math teacher. So what I really do set out to try and do is answer the question, who was this guy really? Why was he protected? And why were these men drawn into his web? And I think, the example of Bill Gates, for example, I do spend some time on how somebody like Jeffrey Epstein, once he was already a sex offender, a known sex offender, could get to Bill Gates. I do spend some time on that. And the answer, I think, is surprising. And that's why people need to listen.
Vicki Elise Jordan here. You obviously have spent almost 2 decades following this story. Your original profile published in Vanity Fair in 2003. What was your relationship like in the years that followed that profile with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell as you continue to report out this story? Could you talk a little bit about what it was like to report on this for so many years?
Yes, I'm really glad you asked me that question, actually. Thank you. So obviously, Jeffrey Epstein threatened me and my unborn children. I was pregnant with twins when I was dealing with him. And he threatened not only to put a curse on them if he didn't like the article that I was going to write, he also wanted to know exactly where I was giving birth, what doctors were involved. And he told me that he knew all the doctors at all the hospitals in New York City. And so when I did end up giving birth 2 months prematurely, my children were severely underweight. I actually was truly terrified that he was going to come for them. I never wanted to see him ever again. I ended up putting guards on my kids, as has been reported. And thank God, I barely did ever see him. I think once or twice I ran into him somewhere. They were not pleasant exchanges. He was, as always, trying to play chess with me. He would try and say something he thought was funny. It wasn't. I actually tried to avoid him. He was somebody with whom I have really evil connotations in my mind. I mean, I find it hard to this day to look at my children who went through severe health problems after that without thinking of Jeffrey Epstein. Ghislaine Maxwell, I also tried to avoid.